Warimi Lingani, Naya Dr. Charlene Leroy Dyer, Garigal Awabakal Daragradri, Payadu Budjari Yagaraturable Euroin. Hello everyone, my name is Dr. Charlene Leroy Dyer. I'm a Garigal Awabakal Daragradri woman and the Director of UQ Business School's Indigenous Business Hub. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of country from wherever you're joining us today, their continual connections, both spiritual to land, sea and community. I'm speaking to you today from the sovereign lands of the Yagara and Turrbal peoples. I pay my respect to elders and those who have walked before us, for they hold the memories, traditions and hopes of Aboriginal peoples, and I extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples joining us today. In acknowledging country today, I acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded by Aboriginal peoples, and this place known as Australia is stolen land. This is and always will be Aboriginal land. You'll notice we have closed captioning enabled to make this webinar more accessible to all viewers. If you would like to turn these on or off, you can do so by clicking the live transcripts button below and following the prompts. If you have any questions throughout today's webinar, please submit these to the Q&A, and these will be addressed during the Q&A part of today's webinar. So I'd now like to introduce today's panellists. Associate Professor Julie Michon joined UQ in May 2023. Her current research revolves around a number of issues relating to disadvantage in education, housing, health, and labour economics. Currently, Associate Professor Michon is developing a research agenda aiming to support the development of better opportunities for Indigenous Australians. This work includes a project to evaluate the impact of Indigenous preferential procurement programs and a project on historical frontier violence, drivers, legacy, and the role of truth-telling, both supported by ARC funding. Her research has been published in international peer-reviewed journals such as the American Economic Journal, Applied and the European Economic Review, and disseminated through media such as The Conversation and SBS. Associate Professor Don Fair is an applied labour economist and economic historian who has published on reconciliation, modern Indigenous labour market experiences, health, and the impact of historical policies on Indigenous economies and people. Dr. Fair received their PhD from the Vancouver School of Economics at the University of British Columbia, Canada, and is currently an Associate Professor of Economics at the University of Victoria. They have published articles in outlets such as the International Journal of Policy, the Journal of Economic History, Public Choice, and the Review of Economic Studies. Associate Professor Kane Polidano is a Principal Research Fellow at the Melbourne Institute at the University of Melbourne, Associate Investigator at the ARC Life Course Centre, and Affiliate at the Dylan Dewar Centre for Indigenous Business Leadership. His research uses administrative data and economic metric tools to inform education, Indigenous and retirement policy. Currently, he's working on an ARC grant relating to Indigenous entrepreneurship, impacts and drivers of Australia's frontier wars, and equity and effectiveness of retirement policies. His work is often partnered with government. Prior to completing his PhD, Dr. Polidano was a senior economist with the Productivity Commission. So the topic for today's webinar is Improving Indigenous Opportunities Around the World, What Will It Take? Indigenous peoples worldwide encounter many challenges that affect their livelihoods, cultures, and well-being. From labour market disadvantage to equal access to education, to discrimination and marginalisation. Our expert panel will discuss these challenges as they address one of the most pressing issues facing Australia and other Indigenous nations. What will it take to improve the odds of Indigenous people today? This complex question calls for collective effort and cooperation from Indigenous, academic and government communities. Using examples from recent research projects, the panellists will explore how Indigenous communities, academics from different disciplines and data custodians can successfully work together to build impactful projects. You'll learn about the challenges of undertaking Indigenous research and discover how embracing a multidisciplinary approach and engaging experts outside of academia can lead to valuable outcomes greater than the sum of their parts, with a particular focus on the role of economics. So I'd now like to welcome our first speaker, Associate Professor Kane Polidano.
Thanks, Charlene, for a very generous and warm introduction. Before I start, I just would like to also say thank you to the organisers for inviting me along. I also want to thank the University of Queensland Economics Department for hosting me over the last 7 weeks. And of course, I want to also acknowledge the traditional owners on whose lands I have been visiting for the last 7 weeks. That are the Yagara and Turrbal people. And I pay my respects for their elders, past, present, and emerging. Today's question is a big question, and I think there's lots of different ways you could sort of address this question. But I think there are two things that I think are irrefutable. One is that addressing this question really does take a lot of effort, like Charlene said in introduction, and a cooperative effort as well. And the other thing that I think is irrefutable is that if this effort is to be effective, then we need to have Indigenous stewardship over the effort in partnership with government and also industry. So in today's presentation, I'll give you hopefully a good reasons why, if you haven't already, you might want to think about getting involved in Indigenous research, because it really is, I think, really key to developing research, to developing collaborative partnerships that are going to take us forward. So agreements between government and Indigenous communities are nothing new, but they are relatively new in Australia. So I think it's really important to start off with by acknowledging that the National Closing the Gap Agreement is something that's very new in Australia. It was signed in 2018. But what it does is it's really about not just about meeting targets anymore, which is what the framework used to be about, but it's very much about working in partnership to address Indigenous disadvantage. And the objective is, as I've quoted here, is to enable Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and governments to work together to overcome inequality experienced by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. The key of the agreement are really 4 reforms. And the first one is priority reform number 1, shared decision-making by consensus and transparent, where matters for decisions are in terms that are easily understood by all parties and where there is enough information and time to understand. The other reforms are really about building a community-controlled sector, so that's giving the sector the resources and also developing the skills needed to be able to make joint decisions on matters that affect Indigenous people. The third reform is improving mainstream institutions. This is mainly government, and it means really improving the cultural awareness of people who work for government. And finally is shared access to data at a regional level. And the regional levels really matters. A lot of data is available at an aggregate level, but really to help inform community decision-making, we need regional level data. So some of you may have heard the Productivity Commission, or heard of the Productivity Commission report on closing the gap agreement that was released earlier this month. And usually the Productivity Commission is pretty guarded when it comes to criticising government, but they didn't pull any punches this time. And what they said is that too many government agencies are implementing versions of shared decision-making that involve consulting with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people on a predetermined solution rather than collaborating on the problem and co-designing the solution. So again, we're still seeing this top-down model of government still persisting today, even though we've got this new agreement. So my argument is to help make this happen, joint decision-making. What we need is better evidence about what works and what doesn't. And this is where I think research, and particularly economic research, because we have a lot of good quantitative skills that can really help in assessing what does and doesn't work, can be really important. And there are a number of ways that you can, or not just us, but all economists really can get involved in trying to provide the evidence that we need to help joint decision-making. One is through co-designing programs directly with community and government. A second model, which I've highlighted here because it's a model that I'll talk about a little bit later on. I think it's also a model that Don and Julie will speak, they'll give examples of as well, and that is research collaborations with Indigenous and government partners. So it's still academically led, but we're getting a lot of input from both government and Indigenous partners. And then the third model is really just helping to try and build a better understanding of what good evidence is within government and also within communities. But I guess my point is that this doesn't mean that we need change for this to happen. And I think what we need is a new impact-first approach. And this means us as academics or researchers really just listening to what Indigenous people need rather than telling them what they need, or telling them or trying to convince them that they need A, B, or C. It's really just about listening and bringing your toolkit and working out how you can help. And it also requires a long-term commitment. Too long and too often, I should say, researchers come into communities, do a research project, and then they disappear. This is really about building long-term relationships. Now, this is an example that I'll share with you, which is a project where we are very much working with Indigenous businesses to try and produce research to help inform government policy about how best to support the Indigenous business sector. It's a collaboration between researchers, some of them in quantitative, like myself and Julie, and other people are other researchers are much more qualitative in nature. And we also work with the Australian Bureau of Statistics, who are helping us develop some of the data, and also policymakers, which are the National Indigenous Australia Agency, who are responsible for supporting the sector. And we're working together to try and build a national longitudinal data set of Indigenous businesses to conduct research to help support policy. There is a very strong Indigenous voice in the project. We adhere to the principles of Indigenous data sovereignty. This means that the project is Indigenous-led, in fact. So it's led by Michelle Evans, who is a qualitative researcher from management. We have an Indigenous-led steering committee that advises us mostly on about interpretation of results and how best to communicate our results. We also have a committee of Indigenous business data custodians. And these people, they're the ones who say yes or no in terms of sharing data for Indigenous business registries. So to be able to develop our data, we need Indigenous data, and we work through the data custodians, who also speak directly to businesses to make sure that they're happy with the use of the data for this purpose. There are two parts of the research agenda. One is an annual snapshot. So we'll use the data to try and highlight the sector, better understand it. It's really hidden. It's been hidden for a long time, but now we're hoping to actually be able to represent the sector to government and also to the wider community. And we're also doing an evaluation of one key government program, which is called the Indigenous Preferential Procurement Policy. We have AFC funding for that. That's a 3-year project to try and understand what impacts the programs have. And so just finally, these are, if you like, it's my wish list of things that I'd like to see change to help better support Indigenous research. And when I talk about these things, I'm also coming from the perspective that in reality, we would like to have, in practice, we would really like to see Indigenous-led research, more Indigenous-led research in this area, but in practice, unfortunately, we don't have a lot of Indigenous colleagues. And so these recommendations are kind of in that environment where we're not really we're faced in a situation where we really don't have many Indigenous colleagues at all. And if we do have them, I mean, they are they are under the pump. They're asked to do a whole raft of different things. So first thing I think that we need to rethink the resources that we need. And I think there is a role for matchmakers within the university. These are Indigenous leaders and elders who have cultural knowledge, who can be like a conduit between the world of research and also communities, but also can be involved in communities in the research themselves. I think we need funding models that are more sympathetic to the time and investment and yarning that's needed to actually do this type of research. ARC funding tends not to support, it just wants to fund research pretty much. And then, of course, when you get seeding grants, we don't really have seeding grants for developing relationships. So there are two holes, I think, in funding arrangements that are available now. We also need to make research more accessible to communities. Communities need information. They need research about their own community, not just about the whole of Australia. And this requires the use, I think, of smart technology to help make the research relevant to them and also accessible to them. We don't see many economic or social forums, workshops outside of major cities, which I think is a terrible shame. As researchers, we travel halfway around the world to go to international conferences, yet I think it's a real shame that we don't talk to people in our own backyard. University recognition of impact as a separate objective to academic excellence, I think would be very helpful. I think a lot of people, I would say myself included, actually enjoy working in projects where they're actually trying to create impact and change. However, sometimes this can be really challenging, especially for early career researchers where the priority really is on academic excellence, not so much on excellence in impact. And I think that universities increasingly are recognising this. And finally, I think that there's a real need to try and operationalise some of the national guidelines about ethical Indigenous research, which I think a lot of it is qualitative and is really set up to cater for interviews or health interventions within one or two communities, but there's no real guidelines on how to do national research using quantitative skills.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much, Charlene, for the introduction, and Kane for setting up the scene really nicely. So I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners and their custodianship of the lands on which we meet today, wherever we are, and pay my respect to their ancestors and their descendants. So what I would like to talk about today is a project on historical frontier violence, its drivers, its legacy, and the role of truth-telling. But this will be a bit of an unusual presentation because I won't be showing you methodologies or results, but instead what I will try to do for the 10 minutes is to try and take you behind the scenes and talk about what happened before we got ARC funding, basically, and how we collectively built the research project and the team. So it all started back in July 2017 when historian Lyndall Ryan launched the first stage of her project, which was to build a nationally verified dataset of Indigenous and settler massacres. Since then, they have built a dataset of more than 400 massacres recorded between 1794 and 1928. Which have killed more than 11,000 people in Australia. So this work was really critical and was really the base of our current project. It has made the scale of historical frontier violence in Australia salient and really unlocked some opportunities to look at how those historical events impact Australia today, in terms of intergenerational impacts on Indigenous Australians, and in terms of the strategies that communities have put in place to reduce the harm and support healing. At this point, we were discussing between ourselves, and I guess it was all very naive, and especially on the side of us economists, the experience with Indigenous research was very limited. But then came the real important questions. And so essentially, we had to ask ourselves, or we were asked by others, questions that I guess in a standard economic project we had not really thought about. So things like, is trying to answer these questions via an academic research project a good way of trying to answer those questions? How do we embed IATSIS and NHMRC principles in the research? Who can contribute and how? And will a research delving into traumatic events do more harm than good? Answering those questions is, I think, challenging for any academic, but maybe especially for economists, because it really takes us in a spot that is unusual for us. And it raises really practical questions about how to go about it. So for instance, we had to think about how can we integrate consultation outside of academia with Indigenous communities, of course, but also with government, with data custodians. And in practice, how do you do this? So who are the people you engage with? How do you reach out to them? How can all of those different people come together and contribute in their own way to the research project? We also had to think about how do we integrate IATSIS and NHMRC principles in quantitative research. So Kane mentioned that. And there is a real question of when you work with data on a computer, and your research project really doesn't involve talking to the people you're researching, how do you embed those principles in practice? It also this type of research also involves multidisciplinary research. So even within academia, we have a variety of languages, expectations that differ by discipline. So how do we manage this, and how do we make sure that everyone can contribute and feels comfortable in the project? And another aspect, and I'm sure I'm forgetting plenty of aspects, by the way, is to address possible concerns around re-traumatization. So how do you ensure that you have all the caveats and disclaimers that are needed to ensure that you protect people who might be harmed by the project? So I've talked quite a bit about challenges, but this is not to say that because it's challenging, we shouldn't try. I think it does mean that it is important to reflect, take the time to build knowledge, take the time to build partnerships with trusting relationships. So in the next few slides, what I'll do is I'll talk more about the Historical Frontier Violence Project, and I'll address some of these questions from the lens of that particular project. But little caveat here, this is one way in which us collectively have chosen to address those questions, but this doesn't mean that there's no other way to address the questions. It's just one example. So there are two main things that I really want to talk about in relation to that project, and one is early consultation. So early consultation, again, is a very unusual thing for an economist to do, and it was very important, and it made the project really better. It was very important to give a voice to many Indigenous Australians so that we could listen and really try to understand and incorporate within the project a number of different perspectives. It really helped reduce unconscious biases. We all have them, however hard we try not to be biased, and open new ways of thinking. So unconscious biases are really important and need to be addressed, and they're not just about discrimination. They're really just about having one perspective. You're one person with one perspective, and so including many different perspectives really helps with trying to reduce those biases. So from the beginning, I'm just going to talk a bit about how we were thinking about the project to begin with, and how consultation kind of sort of deviated slightly from that, and how we changed the perspective a little bit. So in the beginning, we were thinking of this historical project, but really it was really rooted in contemporary Australia, because we were really interested to look at the impact of historical frontier violence on outcomes today. And the whole thinking around it was around reconciliation and about the closing the gap framework. And the idea was that to try and quantitatively demonstrate or test the idea that long-term effects of historical frontier violence are not anecdotal, and that it is really required to acknowledge those and address them if we want to progress reconciliation and improve the well-being of Indigenous Australians today. But what I underestimated from my perspective is the gap in knowledge between Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities. So for Indigenous communities, it was very clear that frontier violence was important, that it is common knowledge, that this knowledge is passed down from generation to generations, and this is represented in artwork. And this is something that came out from all the conversations that we had early on about the project with our Indigenous partners. But at the same time, there is a real will from non-Indigenous Australians to embrace reconciliation. But despite this, there is a lack of knowledge around the issue. So this is a number from 22, so it's not, it's still very recent. Only 63% of Australians believe frontier wars occurred across the continent. So this difference between perspectives really helped us to reframe the question. So for one thing that we did is really to sort of take a sidestep and start to reflect on the perspective of Indigenous peoples and organizations around the intergenerational transmission of trauma and the necessity of truth-telling for healing. So instead of the focus on the closing the gap aspect, it was more about the healing and the truth-telling. The second aspect that came with those conversations is to really focus on increasing awareness in non-Indigenous Australians, again, with the goal of progressing reconciliation and build a common history. So the second aspect I want to talk about, and I don't have much time left, is the team. So it was really important to strike the right balance in terms of expertise and diversity. So we have a large team of CI that cuts across many disciplines with a strong Indigenous presence and expertise in intergenerational trauma. So we're lucky to have Professor Judy Atkinson, who has accepted to join the project, Michelle Evans and Ash Francisco, which really help with the Indigenous knowledge and perspectives. We have a historian, Lyndall Ryan, who was the architect of the map, joining us as well, and some experts in visualization, because again, there is the importance of sharing our results in ways that are sensitive as well. And a few economists. And just about this, I think it was important to find our place in this project. And I think the way to see it is really that we're kind of the mechanics here. We're building, we're bringing our toolkit with us to try and lend it really to try and answer questions that are meaningful for Indigenous Australians and communities. We're supported in doing that by an Indigenous-led steering committee that cuts across a variety of expertise, from intergenerational trauma with the Healing Foundation and the Grandmothers Against Removals, and also people with local knowledge across many states in Australia, and some quantitative expertise as well. So I'll just finish by showing you very quickly the last two slides. I purposefully spent a lot of time explaining what happened before the project happened, because in fact, this was the most important work, and it took years before we got an ARC discovery project that was really the result of all that consultation and the team building exercise. I'm happy to answer questions about the project, but I will leave it at this for now. And the last thing to say is that in building the project, we had discussions and thoughts about where we thought could be the desirable outcomes for communities. And this really relates to acknowledging the impact of intergenerational trauma so that community-led programs can be developed that address the trauma deeply instead of trying to address the symptoms of that trauma. So for instance, violence or substance abuse. And the other thing that is really important in that project is the data that we're building, which hopefully we can share with community to support leaders engaging with their data and being able to develop fit-for-purpose programs based on quantitative evidence. So I'll stop here. Thank you very much. I will stop sharing and hand over to Dawn.
Hello, everyone. And again, thank you to the hosts for having me. I'm very grateful to be here. I'm speaking to you from the Lekwungen territory, and I'm very grateful to live in this unceded land and think about my responsibility as a settler person here. I grew up in Treaty 7 territory in Canada, and I've lived in the lands of the Musqueam. I've been educated there, as well as the lands of the Dakota. And I'm really grateful for all those conversations that inform the work I do and continue to shape it. Now, obviously, as both Kane and Julie alluded to, this is a very large question we were asked about in this panel: improving Indigenous opportunities around the world. What will it take? That's obviously a massive question that is not really answerable by us on the panel. But many First Nations and Indigenous leaders globally are providing answers, and hopefully we can support those answers coming to fruition by the actions of policymakers who sometimes listen to economists. So one of the things that I've determined for myself as a settler researcher is that guiding principles are necessary for research to achieve actually supporting improving Indigenous opportunities in ways that are decolonial. So what I'm showing here is a treaty medallion from treaty negotiations within Canada. It's Treaty 6 specifically, that shows two nations coming together as equals, and some of the language that was used in treaties is brothers or siblings and linking arms together. And I think this principle, even though it's a metaphor, and economists don't always work well in metaphors, of linking arms together helps me think about how I want my research to progress and how it can do so in ethical ways. Another analogy I think has been useful from Indigenous leaders that I've adopted is this idea of building shared houses without damaging the houses that are already here or supporting the rebuilding of those that have been damaged by the process of colonization. So really, I would hope my work can contribute, and I know everyone on the panel wishes to contribute to building shared houses together. And to do that, that partially involves creating a shared understanding of our past and our present. So one of the things that I think economists can contribute when they're thinking about the diverse experiences of Indigenous nations, which are very difficult to generalize over, is first to recognize that traditional economic orders can and do still thrive in the countries in which settler colonial states have established themselves, and new orders that conserve Indigenous well-being can emerge and are currently doing so. Now, our roles as academics, I believe, first include creating inclusive data so we can tell those stories of success and the existence of traditional economic orders that have survived and are still thriving today. As Julie alluded to, I think it's also fundamental that we support truth-telling. So I'm an economic historian. That's part of what we do. It's part of the project that Julie and Kane are part of, and many others. But telling accurate economic histories is crucial for our social narratives. And if policy change and the broader public are going to support Indigenous aspirations, we need to have common sense of our shared history. And really, economic history, or the development of North America in particular, where I'm from, isn't doing that right now, and I think there's a role for economists to support that in doing and telling this accurate history. I think it's also important that economists engage in building new models to give voices to different visions of how economic activity should and can look. Now, many Indigenous societies have had market systems that look very much like the systems we might think about today. Many didn't, and some were different in terms of the rules around property, organization, et cetera. And there's a lot I think we can learn from those if we're thinking about really decolonizing our economies more broadly. And finally, I think an important role that economists can take that's already been alluded to is that we're trained with particular tools that are influential to policymakers, governments, and others. and using those tools to talk about the impact of particular policies that are being enacted in a constrained colonial context is important. We need to know what's working for Indigenous peoples and what isn't according to their own objectives. Now, I'm going to give two examples of projects that are Indigenous nations trying to advance their economic well-being in the market through finance. So this is an example of making actions given current jurisdictional constraints and legislative constraints and broader economic constraints that First Nations in both Canada and the US are facing. So the first project was an example of Nation A and Bank B. Bank B is a Indigenous-owned bank in the United States by a particular nation, Nation B. And Nation A is another nation which hasn't had the same ability to establish their own financial institutions, and their community has never actually had access to traditional financial services. And in this community, we actually partnered with Nation A and Bank B in order to first determine what the desired financial products were of people in Nation A, and how the Bank B could best serve these people, and how people of Nation A felt about Bank B being there, whether they were happy that it was Indigenous owned, or whether they were concerned about the identity of Nation B because they haven't always had peaceful relations, although in times they have as well. So we partnered with them to first roll out a nationwide survey to assess the state of financial access on the reservation, which is under the jurisdiction of Nation A, the local desires for the new bank and its characteristics, and how the ownership structure of the bank would matter for people's support and government's willingness to endorse the project, how that would actually affect consumers' willingness to become customers or potential consumers of the bank. Now, in order to do this project, we went through the Tribal Ethics Board and their Cultural Assessment Board. We worked closely with Bank B to design the survey to ensure it was useful, and Nation A that it was culturally appropriate. We hired 10 local enumerators from the Tribal College and worked closely with the Tribal College to roll out the survey. We were present when we needed to be and tried to not be present when our presence would have not been productive. And we ensured that all parties gained from the project. So in particular, we delivered a full report on the findings of the survey of over 1,000 members of the community to both the nation, with preserving the identity of the people who responded to the survey, in addition with Bank B. And also we delivered a report to the Tribal College that they now use for educating their people. And of course, also our enumerators were rewarded with training, financial enumeration, and also a technology they were allowed to keep or given, or I guess they earned for their work. And this project really came out of relationships that were built between a Bank B and an organization that was an Indigenous-led organization that informed the Federal Reserve, the monetary system of the United States, about the current economic state of Indigenous nations there. Another project that kind of was generated by the same set of networks and relationships was regarding something called secured transaction laws. So in both Canada and the United States, nations have jurisdiction over particular areas that they've negotiated to reserve for their use and benefit through treaties or other methods. And these communities don't always have the same sort of laws that apply in their jurisdictions as in other areas. And one of the things that people were encouraging First Nations to do, particularly governments, other banks, et cetera, was adopt something called secured transaction laws. And these transactions were a way for debtors and creditors to basically rank priority in debt-credit relationships. Now, many people were actually advocating for nations to adopt laws that were identical to the states, but that's a bit of an issue for sovereignty, particularly considering that some of these things that could be used as collateral, say land, cultural property, you might not actually want to be used in that fashion. In addition, you might not have great relationships with the state that you actually have jurisdiction in, so you might not actually want to use some of their systems. So the question we asked in this project is, could you get economic development across reservations in the United States by implementing these laws, but in ways that deviated from a common form or a way that was identical to the states? In order to answer this question, we use annual data on light density, which is a proxy for economic activity. I'm giving you an example here of showing light density of the Flathead Reservation, which is of the Salish and Kootenai Nation, who was happy to have this project shared. to show that after they implemented their secure transaction law, which deviated from state law to address cultural issues, you still have an increase in economic activity. And you see this more broadly. So you can adopt laws in a constrained colonial context that still serve your people on fundamental ways and generate economic growth. It was the message of this research. And finally, I wanted to talk briefly about a project that I am super grateful to be part of called the Indigenous Aspirations Economic Research Cluster at the University of Victoria. As Kane said, we don't always have access to seed funding in order to build relationships and co-create projects with Indigenous nations. This is a multidisciplinary team of 50% settler researchers, 50% Indigenous researchers from law, public administration, business, history, economics, in order to weave their skills together to answer, I guess, three priorities. First is to make visible the Indigenous economic orderings that currently exist that public data just doesn't actually give us. So data on income might miss other forms of production that are really important and valuable. Okay? We also wish to engage in the work of restoring Indigenous economic institutions and practices in a way that aligns with contemporary Indigenous realities and visions by collaborating with the 11 South Island nations that are, again, in this region, which I am grateful to live. And finally, we want to develop ideas about how to create something jointly new, how to build a shared house we can all thrive in and feel culturally comfortable in as an economic system. So I'm very excited to answer any questions you have. I've, of course, given a very high level about my research. I think both Kane and Julie have done me a huge favor by talking some of the other principles and technical details. I'm also happy more broadly to talk about some of the First Nations-led innovations that have been happening in Canada and the United States to promote economic growth and well-being in their communities. So thank you all for your time.
Wow, how wonderful were those presentations. And I think, thank everybody for joining in. I'm going to open up the floor for questions. We do have one that is in Q&A, but I'd like to remind anybody, if you have a question, to put it into the Q&A. So the question we have, sorry, I'm just going to open it again. Would it be practical and sensible to compare service providers? Which is best, for example, in getting someone into long-term employment? Maybe, Kate, I might throw that one to you.
Cool. Thanks, Charlene, and thanks, Gary, for the question. This is, I guess, it's a question that we often ask ourselves as economists doing evaluation, especially in partnership with government, about how do you, obviously you have to build an evaluation framework to do a proper evaluation, which is often challenging. But then the question is, well, what's really to gain by shaming a provider that perhaps is not performing up to standard? And I think what's really important there is to really understand why. So it's not enough, I don't think, as a researcher to do an evaluation, especially comparing service providers, unless you can kind of understand why service provider is or isn't performing to the level. So, and that really is just simply because why matters to be able to change, to initiate change. So just shaming, I think, is that's only going to go so far. The real important issue is to try and understand why, and that's why I think it's really important to work with qualitative researchers as well. So as economists, we're very good at answering questions about whether something is working or not, but understanding why it isn't working, that's where we really need the help of our colleagues in the qualitative sciences to understand, do the surveys and understand why something isn't working or why something is working. So I hope that answers your question, Gary.
Thanks for that, Kane. Don would like to say something.
Well, thank you, Charlene. So I don't, maybe I would like to ask maybe a clarifying question before I attempt to answer. So service providers, I'm making an analogy to the Canadian circumstance. We have something called the Indigenous Employment and Skills Training Program, which provides funding to different Indigenous service providers, which provide training and other sorts of support for re-entering or re-engaging with employment. Is that the same situation in Australia? Is that what was being referred to in the question?
Yes and no. So same within context, but we don't actually have specific Indigenous programs anymore, which is a really big issue.
I see. Okay. Well, thank you. So maybe I'll partly speak to the question through a project that I've been working on with a couple colleagues. So in that project, we are assessing the impact of the Indigenous. Well, actually, at the time, it's an old program that is no longer funded. That's fundamentally the same as the new one. It just has a different name, called the Aboriginal Skills and Labour Force Training Program Assets. And it's true that shaming organizations is not helpful, understanding why they work and when they're able to offer programming that is helping people at least re-enter the labor force, something that we engaged in. The project, we were lucky to be able to also hold engagement meetings once we had some preliminary results to share and figure out figure out exactly what the results meant. So as Kane was saying, that sort of qualitative information is invaluable. And one of the things that we found in the project, and I'm happy to share the research, is that service organizations that have enough financing to provide wraparound services to individuals is really critical, right? And then the second component that we believed was important is labor demand. So you can act on labor supply all you wish to, but if you have an environment where people are heavily discriminated against, it may not matter how skilled you are. Or many, again, reservations in the United States and in Canada have some pretty major barriers for Indigenous communities to set up businesses, even if they want to even use skilled labor if labor is trained. So confronting those challenges for service providers, I think, is important. But again, I hope that actually speaks to the question.
Julie.
No, I just wanted to add something very minor, I guess, reinforcing what Kane was saying also about the collaboration with qualitative researchers and also the collaboration with Indigenous communities. So I think when assessing services or policies, it's really important as well, again, to do this early consultation to make sure that what you're evaluating on, so the outcomes that you're looking at, are actually meaningful. And this will give us a chance of maybe go beyond the purely economic kind of outcomes, because there are many, many more things that might be relevant to assess, especially in this field, but in general. Yeah, that's all.
Thank you very much, panel. So now we have another great question from Karen, who has said, all of you talked about doing research that is warranted by Indigenous communities and is intended for their benefit. But there's a long history of extractive and exploitive research for academics or government purposes. Did you find it hard to overcome these conventions? And what advice would you give people who want to break out of conventional extractive research approaches? Might start with you, Julie.
This is a fantastic question, and I'm sure all three of us want to say something about this. So I'll make sure that I give time for everyone to answer this question. I think I'll go back to early consultation. I think that historically there might have been like objectively really exploitative methods in research, but I think even people who are well-meaning might end up having bad research processes. And Kane mentioned how sometimes people can just go in a community, do some research, and then leave, for example. So these are also things that are akin to exploitation in a certain way. And that should be avoided when research is done. And I think this is where early consultation can really help, because for one thing, it really makes you reflect on your unconscious biases that may be driving the questions you're asking, which might not be the relevant questions to ask, and also build the right relationships. So really investing the time in building trust and making sure that you will be there for the long run. So you're not just doing this as a research project. And I mean, I don't know if Kane and Don agree, but I think that when you enter this field of Indigenous research, it's not a research project anymore. It's a research agenda. It is something that goes even beyond your work, and where you build connections and partnerships beyond just the academia. Yeah, so I guess we found it hard, maybe. I mean, to speak for myself, what I found hard, I guess, is the start of it. So it's getting into that zone which is uncommon for economists, to talk to people before you do the research about what you're planning to do, how, why, what is your intention. But I think once you start doing it, the feedback that you get is really constructive and really helps build a better project. So Kane or Don, whoever goes first.
Might throw to Don.
Yeah.
So I think relational accountability is a really important principle that Julie alluded to, right? So for example, the bank B and Nation A, people in Nation A have my number, they have my email. I'm the CEO of Bank B. I reach out occasionally to see how they're doing, even though we do hope I as a researcher hope we can go back and see how the bank is affecting people's livelihoods. But if that's not desired, then that's also not desired. But I am here if they want to engage in that work. And so, like you said, building relationships and being accountable, and also just not being like, oh, this is a cool project, I'm going to do it, publish in a top journal, get a lot of credit, and then go, right? I mean, that's like the basis for extractive research. But I mean, this is something that I think both Kane and Julie alluded to. We're all trapped in our own time and our own biases, and sometimes even, I mean, there's so much diversity among Indigenous nations and people, right? So you might have people who have relationships with you that think the work you're doing is great, and you might encounter other people who don't think it's great. So navigating that situation is something that is probably the most challenging to figure out when you, as a researcher, are acting constructively in a broad social way and when you aren't. And this is why I think about like these principles of trying to link arms and build shared houses is again, maybe some find it silly metaphors, but I find them really helpful to me. And in terms of doing these principles I think are helpful: relational accountability, and willingness to change and adjust.
Yeah. No, I couldn't agree more with what Don and Julie said about accountability and building relationships. And I think, there's the real challenge, like Don said, is when you do get conflicting views about how your research should be shaped or used within Indigenous communities, especially. And this is not uncommon. But I think it's really important just to be transparent and to be open and justify why you've done what you've done. And the reason why, the benefit that potentially can come from it. So you have to be very clear about what the benefits are. And if some people don't view them as benefits, and sometimes they won't, then it's just a matter of being transparent and also acknowledging that sometimes what you think is a benefit can also be, so it's for some people a cost. But you have to weigh up benefits and costs all of the time as economists, and we just have to be transparent.
I think Don wanted to say something else.
Maybe just a mild addition, and this is something that I personally struggle with, is knowing what is a short-term benefit versus a long-term one. So I made this distinction between thinking about what projects and evaluation tools are helpful within the particular environment we currently exist, and whether those align with long-run visions of where we want to go. So for example, if we think about I think one word that I've heard used before is like financialization of Indigenous nations. I mean, you could reframe it as like access to credit. Access to credit can be really useful for building economic resilience, getting infrastructure projects being built. But then I know that there's also a feeling of, okay, so now we're just buying into a system that maybe people don't agree with, right? I mean, this is kind of also a broader question of trying to gain financial power in the moment in a broader colonial system versus change the system more broadly, I think is maybe sometimes at odds. And how we kind of grapple with that as thinkers, and I'm not just talking about academics, but just as a collective, is really challenging. And I wish I had a better answer to that.
Thanks, everyone. And I, as an Aboriginal person myself, I'd just like to add, there has been a lot of research in the past done about us, without us. And I think that, as the panel here has shown, there are really positive ways about going about research with and for Aboriginal peoples and their communities. And just remembering that it's all about the Aboriginal community, not about the researcher, you know, and that's the most important thing. It's benefits for community that we're thinking about in this aspect. And I think that a lot of times that doesn't seem to be the right goal, but that should be the right way to go forward. So we have another question from an anonymous person. Do you have any advice for how or if the right balance can be struck between First Nations community needs versus government and political needs? I'm going to throw to you for this one, Kane, because you've had a lot of experience, I bet, in this area.
Yeah. Well, I mean, before I mentioned that there's often conflict between Indigenous groups who have different interests. Clearly, there are very different interests often between government and communities. And yeah, I think that this is being able to diffuse the tension between these interests, I think always comes down to being pretty much the same. It's the same answer to the last question, really, which is about being able to build trust and being able to communicate from the start what the objectives of the research are in a very clear way, and also being clear about what are the trade-offs, because you know, there's always winners and losers in any sort of evaluation of policy or any research. We often find that what might be a policy that is very popular within government may not have benefits that are universal within the communities. Some communities may benefit, some may not. So you're always going to get these points of tension, I think, in any sort of policy or policy evaluation. And I think it's just always really important to be very clear about what the objectives of any study are or any evaluation. And again, just being real and being transparent about how you went about it. But ultimately, governments they'll operate under their own sort of agenda. It's only as a researcher, all we can do is just make it clear what these trade-offs are. And ultimately, it's government that does make the trade-offs. So we can't really dictate to government, I don't think, about how they should make trade-offs. But we just need to make them explicit.
And we've probably got 1 minute left. If anybody else would like to say anything on that topic.
Yeah, maybe just that I feel that this has to do with the timeline of the research as well. So I think, I mean, community needs really come firsthand in the sense of like identifying the relevant questions and what are the relevant needs for evaluation. I'm thinking of economic evaluation. Whereas the government needs, in a sense, I think that they need evidence. I mean, maybe I'm telling them what they need and they don't need that, but I think what they need is quantitative evidence. And so providing them with that quantitative evidence that supports the trade-offs they have to make. So like Ken was saying, making that obvious to them, making the evidence available to them. We can't force them to make decisions based on that, but at least helping them see the quantitative evidence can help. So, and that can bring all of those things together at the end.
Okay. Final word, Don?
We have to make sure that data exists so we can be aware of the trade-offs as well, right? Of course, in a way that respects custodians' desires, but unfortunately, governments often don't collect data that's against their interests or their own objectives. So it's something to keep in mind, whether you work for government or you're a researcher that might be doing work relevant to them.
Thank you. Well, what a great and informative webinar. Please join me in thanking our speakers, Kane, Julie and Don, for their time and talking to us today about improving Indigenous opportunity around the world.